Most people treat focus like it's a discipline problem, that you get distracted because you lack willpower or motivation. But focus isn't a decision, it's a biological state. Your brain has specific physiological conditions that need to be met for sustained attention to even be possible. And if those conditions aren't met, willpower doesn't override them. You're not fighting bad habits here, you're fighting your own neuroscience. In this video, I'm going to go through what those conditions actually are, what's destroying them, and what a fully optimized focus session looks like from the moment you wake up to the moment you stop working. Sustained attention runs through your prefrontal cortex. It holds all the task-relevant information online while you're working, filters out any irrelevant input, and it keeps your behavior directed toward one thing. When it's working at its full capacity, you can stay locked in on your work, but when it's not, your mind will drift every few minutes and you can't get into deep focus. There's 3 neuromodulators that determine whether your prefrontal cortex is in that state. The first is norepinephrine. It sets your brain's signal-to-noise ratio. Moderate norepinephrine means you can filter what's relevant from what isn't. Too little and your prefrontal cortex will be sluggish. Too much, usually from things like stress, and everything will feel equally urgent. There's a narrow optimal zone here, and most people are outside of it. The second is acetylcholine. It amplifies your attended signals and drives what researchers call attentional effort. It is the mechanism behind actually locking onto something and staying locked on it. It's also directly sensitive to your arousal level and sleep quality. The third is dopamine. It acts as a gate in your prefrontal cortex. It controls what gets into your working memory and what gets blocked. Too little of it and your working memory will be leaky and everything bleeds in. Too much and that gate will close, making it harder to update your thinking. Again, there is an optimal zone here. This is the ceiling that matters for everything that follows. Your working memory, which is the active workspace that your prefrontal cortex manages, can hold about 3 to 4 separate pieces of information at once. This is from Luck and Vogel's research, and that number has held up across decades of replication. A researcher named Randall Engel built on this further, showing that your working memory capacity is essentially the same thing as your ability to maintain goals under interference. It's not a storage tank, it's a resistance mechanism, and it does have a hard limit. This is extremely important because your deep work, whether that's writing, coding, or complex problem solving, requires holding intermediate states, goals, and constraints active while filtering out everything else. When the conditions for your prefrontal cortex are off, that capacity collapses. Everything in this video is about protecting and priming those conditions. Your cognitive capacity doesn't stay flat across the day. It fluctuates. Researcher Peretz Lavie documented roughly 90-minute oscillations in our brain arousal during wakefulness. And this has become the basis for a lot of productivity advice about structuring your day in 90-minute blocks. I want to be accurate about what the evidence actually says here, because a lot of the content out there oversimplifies it. The oscillations in EEG arousal are real, but the idea that your focus peaks and crashes on a precise, predictable 90-minute schedule is extrapolated further than the data actually supports. Reviews of the literature find that clear performance dips tied to this rhythm are most consistent when your circadian drive is already weak, such as in the early afternoon, and that many cognitive performance studies simply don't show a clean 90-minute pulse. What is well established here is that your performance on sustained attention tasks degrades with the time you spend on that task. In research, measurable declines can start within 30 minutes of continuous, demanding work. The literature doesn't support one universal optimal block length because it depends heavily on the type of task you're doing, the workload, and the person doing it. Research on chronotypes show that late adolescence and early adulthood shifts your internal clock toward later timing. Lots of people in this age range are genuinely biologically wired as late chronotypes, and forcing an early schedule will create what researchers call social jet lag. It's a misalignment between your internal clock and your actual schedule that degrades your attention and performance even if you're getting 8 hours of sleep. If you consistently feel the sharpest in the late morning or early afternoon rather than mid-morning, that could be a sign of your chronotype. The practical takeaway here is to plan your most demanding cognitive work for your personal peak alertness window. Build in a genuine break before you feel your performance falling, not after. And don't rely on a specific number of minutes. Monitor your own output quality and treat it degrading as the signal. Before I get to the protocol, you need to understand what's actively destroying your prefrontal cortex's operating conditions. There's three main mechanisms here. The first is adenosine buildup. Every single hour you're awake, a compound called adenosine accumulates in your brain as a byproduct of cellular energy use. It binds to receptors in your forebrain and progressively suppresses the excitatory drive that your prefrontal cortex depends on. This is what brain fog actually is. There is a specific chemical signal building up in your prefrontal regions. Caffeine works by blocking the receptor that reads that signal, which temporarily restores your prefrontal cortex's excitability. But when caffeine wears off, the adenosine that built up while the receptors were blocked hits all at once. That's what the common afternoon crash people get is. It's adenosine that's been deferred. The second is attention residue. A researcher named Sophie Leroy showed that every time you switch tasks, part of your attention stays stuck on what you just left. Your prefrontal cortex can't fully reset to the new task because it's still partially running context from the old one. Gloria Mark's field research at UC Irvine put a specific number on this. After an interruption, like checking your phone, opening another tab, or responding to a notification, externally interrupted work wasn't resumed for an average of 22 minutes and 37 seconds. That's not a lab finding. That comes from workers in a real environment being tracked in real time. And on top of that, the same research found that knowledge workers naturally switch tasks roughly every 3 minutes when left to their own patterns. That's the baseline most people are operating at. The cost isn't that one interruption, it's the constant fragmentation of context. The third is chronic mild sleep restriction. In a 2003 study, subjects were restricted to 6 hours of sleep per night for 14 days in a row. By the end, their performance had declined to the equivalent of 2 full nights of complete sleep deprivation. The subjects felt only mildly tired after the first few days and stopped noticing further decline, but their objective performance kept getting worse every single day. The key finding here is that they felt completely fine, but their performance had dropped significantly and kept dropping. The first thing here is your phone in the room, even if you're not touching it. A study by Ward and colleagues at the University of Texas found that the mere presence of a phone on the desk reduced available cognitive capacity compared to having it in another room. And this held up even when the participants were specifically instructed to not use it. Your brain allocates resources to resisting the phone, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. Put it in another room, not just face down or in your pocket. The second is music, specifically music with lyrics. A recent controlled study found that music with lyrics hurt people's verbal memory, visual memory, and reading comprehension. Instrumental music, on the other hand, didn't reliably help or hurt. If you're doing language-heavy work like writing, reading, or coding, lyrics are a measurable performance drag. The third is caffeine in the first 60 to 90 minutes after you get up. When you first wake up, your body naturally produces a cortisol spike that handles your morning alertness. Stacking caffeine on top of that gives you diminishing returns. More importantly, though, evidence on caffeine tolerance shows that some of the benefit that regular users feel from the early caffeine may be withdrawal reversal, not an actual enhancement. Delaying your first caffeine lets the natural cortisol mechanism do its job first. The fourth is bad air quality, and this one is really underappreciated. Research published in the Environmental Health Perspectives found that elevated CO2 levels that are still within the normal range of a closed bedroom or small office measurably impaired decision-making. A separate study found that cognitive performance scores were roughly 60 to 100% higher on days with lower CO2 and cleaner indoor air versus conventional office conditions. Open a window or get some ventilation before you start your work. The first thing here is morning sunlight. Within the first 30 minutes after you get up, get in front of a bright light. Natural daylight is going to trigger your suprachiasmatic nucleus to sharpen your cortisol awakening response and raise your norepinephrine baseline. That is the same neuromodulator that sets the signal-to-noise ratio in your prefrontal cortex. If you wake up before sunrise and can't get outside, use a 10,000 lux light here. The second is brief movement. 5 to 10 minutes of moderate exercise before your session improves your executive function and attention. The mechanism here is a surge in your norepinephrine and epinephrine that your prefrontal cortex directly runs on. There's also evidence for a BDNF increase, which is a protein that's involved in your synaptic function, following exercise. Though I'll be honest that peripheral BDNF measurements are an imperfect representative for what's actually happening in your brain. The catecholamine effect is a more reliable mechanism. A light jog or a short, high-effort burst will work here. The goal is to raise your baseline arousal before you start working. The third thing here is caffeine with L-theanine around 60 to 90 minutes after you get up. Controlled studies on this combination show that L-theanine smooths caffeine's arousal profile and improves aspects of its attentional control compared to just taking caffeine alone. The most studied ratio here is about 1 to 2. For example, 100 milligrams of caffeine with 200 milligrams of L-theanine. This is a well-studied, simple, and basic stack. The delay after you wake up is the most important thing with this. The fourth thing here is clearing your environment. Close your other tabs, clear your desk, and ventilate your room. And as I talked about earlier, put your phone in another room. These aren't willpower tools. They are going to reduce the background load on your main focus system that has a hard capacity ceiling. The fifth thing here is to set your session explicitly. A researcher named Peter Gallwitzer did work on implementation intentions and found that forming a specific if-then plan before your task starts measurably improves your follow-through and reduces initiation lag. Nothing vague like I'm going to study X subject, but something specific that includes exactly what you're working on and exactly how long you'll be working on it. Your prefrontal cortex uses context cues to enter task mode. If you have a consistent, specific start ritual, it'll give it a reliable signal. Performance on demanding cognitive tasks degrades with the time you spend on that task. Vigilance research shows that this can start within 30 minutes of any high-demand, sustained attention conditions. Though the real-world knowledge work is more complex, and the individual variation matters here. The most defensible claim here is an aspecific block length. It's that continuous, unbroken performance takes a tax on you, and that scheduled breaks will outperform waiting until you fail. A practical range of 60 to 90 minutes per deep work block is consistent with the literature, but monitor your own output here. If your mistake rate starts climbing and your thinking gets foggy or you're rereading the same material without actually retaining anything, those are signals that you're depleted. The work you produce past genuine depletion isn't good work. A distinction worth making here is that productive struggle and real depletion will feel different. Productive struggle is hard, but it's generative. You're pushing at the edge of what you can hold in your working memory and making actual progress, even if it's slow. That's where your best output happens. Real depletion is when your thinking becomes confused rather than just difficult. You'll make mistakes you wouldn't normally make, and nothing will move forward. When your focus breaks mid-session, a 1 to 2 minute physical reset, like standing up, moving, or looking away from your screen, can partially restore the state. Research on micro breaks shows reliable improvements in both vigor and fatigue reduction. But for meaningful cognitive performance restoration, you generally need at least 10 minutes. Use those brief resets to get you through the end of your session and then take a full break. One more thing about the re-entry, when you come back from any break, spend around 60 to 90 seconds revealing exactly where you left off before you start trying to produce. Reread your last paragraph or check your notes. Your prefrontal cortex needs to reconstruct context before it can operate at depth. Forcing it to start cold costs more time than the review saves. Most people will fill their breaks by spending time on their phone, but this is counterproductive. When you stop your focus to work and your prefrontal cortex disengages, a separate network activates called the default mode network. The default mode network is active during rest, mind-wandering, and internally directed thought. It's not idle. The research shows that it plays a direct role in your memory consolidation, making associated connections across stored information, and processing what you just worked out in the background. This is where solutions to problems you were stuck on earlier tend to surface. During a walk, in the shower, or while you're sitting quietly, your default mode network is running those loose associative processings that the focused prefrontal cortex mode actively suppresses. If you pick up your phone during a break, you haven't left that task mode. You just switch to a different task-positive demand. Your brain stays in the network that processes external input rather than shifting to the one that consolidates and recovers. Research by Berman, John Ides, and Kaplan showed that walking in nature or even viewing nature images measurably improved people's directed attention performance afterward, using the same attention measures used in clinical testing. The mechanism from attention restoration theory is that natural environments provide what researchers call soft fascination. It's low-level sensory engagement that doesn't compete with direct attention resources and allows your restorative system to run. Practically, this means that your break activity determines whether your next session starts at near full capacity or at a fraction of it. Walking, sitting outside, staring at something visually calm, or breath work. Anything that lets your mind move internally rather than just processing external demands. For the break duration, the research on breaks showed that short pauses under 5 minutes reliably improve how you feel, but don't fully restore your cognitive performance on demanding tasks. For real recovery, the data supports at least 10 minutes of genuine disengagement. This is the target number between your sessions. And my final note on timing, for most people, the early afternoon is a predictable vulnerability window for your sustained attention. It's driven by the interaction of circadian and homeostatic processes. Lab studies confirm this is real and modifiable with bright light exposure or a short nap if your schedule allows it. If you can structure your day so that your lowest demand work lands in that window rather than your deepest cognitive work, your total output across the day will be higher. That's every variable that science knows about. The biology of what focus actually is, the rhythm it runs on, less destroying your capacity, and the full protocol from priming to recovery. If you want the even more in-depth, full written version with every study cited, my research archive has the complete focus and cognitive output protocol.